We've been talking about civil rights. There's also the election coming up, and right around the time Hogan, announced his book coming out, he made a move that surprised a lot of people. That is, we're going to try to conduct a normal election in November. You had a piece in the Washington Post titled "Larry Hogan is creating chaos and fear for the November election." Can you talk about what to expect in just a few months?
Well, I think the first thing that is really concerning was the decision to make this transition. One thing you want to note about that June primary and the April 28th special congressional election to replace Elijah Cummings that were conducted as universal vote by mail elections was that they were extraordinarily successful. In the April 28th special congressional election, turnout was 10% higher than the primary in February, which was actually the more competitive race. It was a Democratic primary in a Democratic enclave, and that was conducted the old-fashioned way. On the June 26th election, Maryland had some record high turnout. There were more Maryland Democrats who voted in that presidential primary in 2020 than in any other presidential primary in Maryland history. There's only one other election that had a higher percentage turnout, and that was in 2008 for Obama. You had more people vote in that primary as Democrats than in any other election in Maryland history. And it was especially successful in Baltimore. The turnout in the primary overall was 48%. That was 3 percentage points higher than in 2016. And then you had more voters vote in the mayoral primary than in any other since 1983. So one thing we found with vote by mail is that not only has it been extraordinarily successful at boosting turnout, and we've seen that in other parts of the country, right? The vote by mail states in the 2018 midterms had 10 percentage point higher turnout rate than the average nationwide. But what we learned in Maryland, and especially in Baltimore, was that it's successful even in low-income minority neighborhoods. And it's successful when you follow a certain formula. And that is you mail everyone a ballot, but you make sure to hold enough in-person vote center options so that the voters who either don't have access to mail or the remedies, which in many cases can be technology, right? Because one thing the State Board of Elections will do, if you don't get your ballot in the mail and you report it, they can email you a PDF and you can mail it back or drop it off at a Dropbox. Of course, a lot of low-income people don't have access to printers or even computers. So you have to have those remedies in place. But so long as you do, and if you have enough vote centers for enough of voters, Amber McReynolds, the head of the National Vote at Home Institute, who ran Denver's elections office, says you basically need one for every 30,000 voters. As long as you do that, you have very few complications. Voters who don't get their ballots in the mail are able to vote in person, and you get really high turnout. That's overall. When you have a pandemic like COVID-19, this becomes even more urgent and necessary because, for starters, it's in the public health to have more people voting at home and not going to polling places where you have high traffic, a lot of people coming in, touching the same pens and doorknobs, standing close to each other, right? That's not what we should be doing, especially as infection rates are surging and we don't know what's going to be the case in November. We're expecting a potential second wave. It could be very dangerous. And at a time when you are setting up local election boards to fail. I've spoken to a number in the last few weeks who say, we're not equipped to handle this. So just take Anne Arundel County, for example. They are short of 1,050 election judges they need to operate their 195 polling places. So A, they're not going to be able to recruit them because most of the times the people who fill in those roles are elderly, more at-risk people. And they also have other problems in terms of expenses, right? It's going to cost a lot of money, not only to keep these polling places open, but to provide all the safety equipment, right? David Garris, who's the deputy elections director of Anne Arundel County, told me it will cost $200,000 on plexiglass alone for their county. Another thing is a lot of the places that are polling places, like schools and senior centers, do not want to allow voting in those spaces. Anne Arundel County has already had 18 back out, and that's just as of last week when I spoke to him. In Baltimore City, you have another issue, which is reflective of another issue across the state, which is how are you going to train election officials and election judges, right? The University of Baltimore trains 4,000 of the some 20,000 election judges throughout the state, and the president of the university is not allowing those trainings to take place on campus. So because of this decision, you're setting up local election boards not to have the equipment and the capacity and the manpower to run these things effectively. You're going to have really long lines. It's going to take one of the reasons lines were long on June 26th was because how much time it took to clean up in between voters coming in and out. That was compounded by the fact that they just didn't open enough of the in-person vote centers. But only less than 3% of the voters who voted, period, voted in person. So the vast majority voted by mail. So I think you're going to have a lot of problems trying to run the election this way. And that's why not a single member of the State Board of Elections advocated for a traditional normal election. You had a split. There were 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. 2 advocated for universal vote by mail, mailing everyone a ballot, keeping a few limited polling places open. Another one said, mail everyone an absentee ballot and limit polling places. Those were the Republicans, and then there were the Democrats. And Hogan took the option that nobody wanted, which was a traditional election, and open all the 1,600 plus polling places and leave these local election boards unequipped to handle what they're going to have to do in November. So I think it's a really dangerous and bad decision. I think it risks disenfranchising voters, and especially low-income minority voters. I also think forcing people to have to fill out an absentee application is a big mistake. Especially since Maryland has seen the success of simply mailing every voter a ballot. For one, it's more expensive. You've got to pay to mail everyone the application, and then you're going to have to pay to mail it back to everyone. Election officials are very concerned that with many things, people wait for the last minute, and those ballots are going to come in a week or be postmarked just before the deadline, and they're going to have to figure out how many they have to produce in a very short period of time. And the other thing is, it's going to confuse voters. It's very confused messaging, which is we want everyone to absentee vote, but we're going to have every single polling place open. So I think it's going to be a very costly election, and I think those estimates should come out over the next few weeks, and that's going to be very important. And I think it's going to reduce turnout, and it's going to create more chaos and confusion than we would have had we simply just followed the model that was successful in June and April, but make little fixes that would have remedied the few problems that we did experience.